When enemy fire rips through the jungle canopy and your brothers are bleeding out in a kill zone with no way home, you learn that impossible is just another word for Tuesday. But what happens when the person holding your lifeline isn't who you expected? What happens when everything you thought you knew about courage, precision, and brotherhood gets turned upside down by someone the system said didn't belong there in the first place? This is the story of how one woman's trigger finger rewrote the rules of warfare and saved lives that everyone else had already written off as lost. The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Liberty's firing range as Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her grip on the Barrett M82A 150 caliber sniper rifle. The weapon weighed nearly 30 pounds, but in her hands it felt as natural as breathing. Around her, the usual crowd of Rangers had gathered, some watching with genuine curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism etched across their sun-weathered faces. "You sure about this, Santos?" called out Sergeant First Class Jake Mitchell, his arms crossed as he leaned against a concrete barrier. "That thing's got a kick that'll put you on your ass." Maria didn't look up from her scope adjustments. She'd heard variations of this conversation 100 times before, ever since she'd arrived at the forward operating base 6 months ago. The first female sniper assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment's operations in Afghanistan, she'd spent every day since proving that her presence wasn't some political experiment gone wrong. "Mitchell, the only thing getting put on its ass today is that target downrange," she replied, her voice steady as she settled into her shooting position. The familiar weight of the rifle across her shoulder brought an immediate sense of calm. The same feeling she'd discovered as a 12-year-old girl shooting cans off fence posts on her grandfather's ranch in Texas. The target sat 1,200 meters away, barely visible through the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor. It was a standard training exercise, but Maria knew every shot she took was being judged against an impossible standard. She had to be better than good. She had to be perfect. Captain Derek Thompson approached the firing line, his clipboard in hand and stopwatch ready. Thompson was old-school Army, a man who'd earned his stripes in Iraq and had initially fought against having Maria assigned to his unit. Not because he doubted women's capabilities in combat, he'd explained during their first meeting, but because he worried about unit cohesion and the added complications that came with integrating female soldiers into an all-male special operations environment. "All right, Santos," Thompson said, his voice carrying across the range. "Standard engagement drill. Multiple targets at varying distances. You've got 90 seconds to engage 6 targets, longest shot at 1,500 meters. Miss more than one, and we're back to discussing your reassignment to a support role." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Maria had known this moment would come eventually. Despite her consistently high scores during training and her flawless performance in controlled environments, there remained an underlying current of doubt about whether she could perform when it truly mattered. The Rangers had a saying, "Under pressure you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to your level of training." Today would determine what her true level was. She glanced around at the assembled Rangers, reading the mixture of expressions on their faces. Some, like Corporal Danny Rodriguez, offered encouraging nods. Rodriguez had been one of her few early supporters, having seen her shoot during their initial training exercises. Others, like Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, watched with the skeptical attention of men who'd seen too many promising soldiers fold under pressure. "Understood, sir," Maria replied, settling behind the Barrett once more. She began her breathing exercises, the same ones her grandfather had taught her decades ago. Inhale slowly, exhale halfway, hold, find that natural respiratory pause where the body is perfectly still, and squeeze the trigger with the pad of her index finger, never the joint. The first target appeared at 800 meters. Maria found it through her scope, made minute adjustments for wind and elevation, and sent the first round downrange. The .50 caliber bullet traveled at over 2,800 feet per second, and the target dropped immediately with a satisfying metallic clang that echoed across the range. "Good hit," Thompson called out. But there was no emotion in his voice. 1 target down, 5 to go. The second target popped up at 1,000 meters, partially concealed behind a simulated building structure. This was where many soldiers struggled, having to account for the increased bullet drop and the psychological pressure of a more difficult shot. Maria tracked the target, calculated her holdover, and squeezed the trigger. Another hit. As she worked through the targets, Maria's mind wandered briefly to the path that had brought her here. Growing up in rural Texas, she'd been the only girl in her high school's shooting club, often outperforming boys who'd been hunting since they could walk. Her grandfather, a Korean War veteran, had been the one to first put a rifle in her hands, teaching her that shooting was as much about mental discipline as it was about physical ability. "Shooting's like life, mija," he told her during one of their weekend range sessions. "It's not about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about being the most prepared, the most focused, and having the courage to take the shot when it matters most. The third and fourth targets fell in quick succession, both at challenging angles that required Maria to adjust not only for distance but for the geometry of the shot. She was operating in that zone that all great marksmen knew, where conscious thought gave way to instinct and hours of training took over. 30 seconds remaining, Thompson announced, and Maria could hear the surprise creeping into his voice. She was ahead of schedule and hadn't missed yet. The fifth target presented itself at 1,300 meters, the furthest she'd attempted in front of an audience. At this distance, factors like the Coriolis effect from the Earth's rotation began to matter. The bullet would be in flight for over 2 seconds, enough time for conditions to change. Maria made her calculations, settled into her position, and took the shot. The target dropped. "Jesus Christ," she heard someone mutter behind her. It might have been Mitchell. The final target was the real test. At 1,500 meters, it pushed the effective range of the Barrett MA2A1. More importantly, it was positioned to simulate an actual combat scenario, partially concealed and requiring a precise shot to ensure a clean hit. This was the shot that would determine not just Maria's immediate future, but whether she'd earn the respect of the men she might one day fight alongside. Maria chambered her final round and settled into position. Through her scope, the target seemed impossibly small, wavering in the heat distortion like a mirage. She controlled her breathing, feeling her heart rate slow as she entered that meditative state that separated great shooters from merely good ones. The wind had shifted slightly, coming now from her 2 o'clock position at approximately 8 miles per hour. She adjusted her point of aim accordingly, accounting for both the wind drift and the significant bullet drop over such a distance. The mathematics of ballistics played out in her head automatically, the result of thousands of hours of training and study. 10 seconds, Thompson called out. Maria found her natural respiratory pause, aligned her sight picture perfectly, and squeezed the trigger with the same gentle pressure she'd used to crack an egg. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the massive muzzle brake redirecting the blast in a controlled explosion of sound and fury. For 2.5 seconds, everyone on the range held their breath as the bullet carved its path through the morning air. Then, at 1,500 meters downrange, the target dropped with a distant clang. The silence that followed was broken only by the desert wind whistling through the range's infrastructure. Maria remained in position for a moment longer, partly to maintain proper form, but mostly to savor what she knew was a pivotal moment in her military career. "Holy shit," Mitchell said, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine amazement. "That was a hell of a shooting demonstration, Santos." Captain Thompson approached with his clipboard, checking off the final item on his evaluation sheet. When he looked up, there was something different in his eyes, a recognition that hadn't been there before. "Outstanding performance, Staff Sergeant," he said formally. Then, dropping his voice so only she could hear, he added, "Welcome to the team. For real this time." As Maria began cleaning her rifle, the other Rangers gathered around, their previous reservations seemingly evaporated in the face of her demonstrated competence. But even as she accepted their congratulations and answered their technical questions about her shooting technique, Maria knew that today's success was just the beginning. Proving herself on a controlled range was one thing. The real test would come when lives hung in the balance and there was no second chance for a missed shot. 3 weeks later, Maria found herself aboard a Chinook helicopter flying through the Hindu Kush Mountains toward what intelligence reports described as a routine reconnaissance mission. The irony wasn't lost on her that in Afghanistan, routine missions had a way of becoming anything but routine in a matter of seconds. Sitting across from her in the helicopter's cramped cargo bay was the same group of Rangers who'd watched her shoot that morning on the range. Mitchell was there, now serving as the team's designated marksman with his M14 enhanced battle rifle. Rodriguez occupied the door gunner position, his M240B machine gun at the ready. Staff Sergeant Webb served as the team's communications specialist, while Captain Thompson led the 8-man unit that also included Medic Sergeant Tom Harrison, explosives expert Corporal Mike Anderson, and intelligence analyst Sergeant Lisa Park. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. Intelligence had identified a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces, operating from a compound in a remote valley. The Rangers' job was to establish an observation post on a nearby ridgeline, confirm the target's presence, and call in an airstrike if conditions were favorable. 20 minutes out, the pilot announced over the intercom, his voice barely audible over the twin rotors' thunderous beating. Maria checked her equipment one final time. The Barrett MA2A1 was secured in its custom case, while her M4 carbine hung across her chest in a tactical sling. Her kit included enough ammunition for a sustained engagement. along with the usual assortment of grenades, first aid supplies, and communication equipment that every ranger carried into hostile territory. "You nervous?" Rodriguez asked, leaning close so she could hear him over the helicopter noise. Maria considered the question. Was she nervous? Certainly. There was anticipation, the natural physiological response to approaching danger. But beneath that was something else, a steady confidence born from years of training and the knowledge that she belonged here, with these men, doing this job. "Ready," she replied, which was a more accurate description of her mental state. As the Chinook began its descent toward the landing zone, Maria looked out through one of the small windows at the rugged landscape below. Afghanistan was a harsh, unforgiving country that had humbled empires throughout history. The mountains rose like ancient monuments to futility, their peaks crowned with snow even in the summer heat. Somewhere in those mountains, Taliban fighters waited in positions they'd held for generations, armed with intimate knowledge of the terrain and a fanatical dedication to driving out foreign invaders. But Maria had her own advantages. She had training that represented the pinnacle of American military precision. She had equipment that surpassed anything the enemy could field. Most importantly, she had teammates who'd finally accepted her as an equal member of their brotherhood. The helicopter touched down with a jar that sent dust swirling through the cabin. Within seconds, the Rangers were moving, filing out of the aircraft with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this dozens of times before. Maria followed Thompson toward the tree line, her Barrett case strapped to her back and her M4 at the ready. As the Chinook lifted off behind them, disappearing quickly into the morning sky, the Rangers found themselves alone in enemy territory. The only sounds were their own controlled breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The mission had officially begun. Captain Thompson gathered the team around a large boulder that provided both cover and concealment from potential enemy observation. He spread his map across the rock surface, using his compass and GPS device to confirm their location. "We're here," he said, pointing to a position marked on the map. "Target compound is 3 kilometers north-northeast in this valley. Our observation post will be here, on this ridgeline. Santos, I want you positioned where you can cover the entire valley with your Barrett, but also be prepared to provide overwatch for the team if we need to move." Maria studied the topographical map, noting the elevation changes and potential fields of fire. The ridgeline Thompson had selected would put her approximately 800 meters from the target compound, well within the effective range of her weapon. More importantly, it offered multiple escape routes if the mission went sideways. "Copy that, sir," she replied. "What's the backup plan if things go loud?" "There's an alternate landing zone here." Thompson indicated a flat area roughly 1 kilometer south of their current position. "If we need emergency extraction, that's where the birds will come. But intel suggests this should be a quiet operation. We observe, we report, and we go home." The team began moving through the forest, following an ancient goat trail that wound its way up the mountainside. Maria took up position near the rear of the formation, her eyes constantly scanning for signs of enemy activity. The weight of the Barrett case across her shoulders served as a constant reminder of the responsibility she carried. When the time came, her teammates would be counting on her precision to keep them alive. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that today would be anything but routine. Experience had taught her to trust her instincts. And right now, every instinct she possessed was telling her that they were walking into something much more dangerous than a simple reconnaissance mission. The question wasn't whether they'd face combat today. The question was whether she'd be ready when that moment arrived. The climb took 3 hours, each step carefully placed to minimize noise and avoid loose rocks that might betray their presence. Maria's legs burned from the combination of altitude, weight, and the relentless upward grade. But she maintained her position in the formation without complaint. Around her, the other Rangers moved with the silent efficiency of predators, their weapons ready and their senses tuned to every sound and movement in the forest. When they finally reached the observation post, Maria understood immediately why Captain Thompson had selected this location. The ridgeline offered a commanding view of the valley below, with excellent concealment provided by a cluster of large boulders and sparse vegetation. More importantly, it provided multiple fields of fire and several escape routes if their position became compromised. Thompson hand-signaled for the team to establish their positions. Rodriguez and Webb set up the communications equipment behind the largest boulder, while Harrison and Anderson took positions covering the team's flanks. Park, the intelligence analyst, began setting up her laptop and satellite communication gear to maintain contact with headquarters. Maria found her designated position among the rocks, a natural depression that offered both protection and an unobstructed view of the valley. She carefully unpacked the Barrett M82A1, assembling the weapon with the practiced movements of someone who could do it blindfolded. Sex! The rifle's distinctive profile seemed almost organic against the rocky landscape, as if it had been designed specifically for this environment. Through her high-powered scope, Maria began studying the target compound 800 meters below. The intelligence briefing had described it as a typical Afghan rural structure, but seeing it firsthand revealed details that photographs couldn't capture. The main building was constructed of mud, brick, and timber, surrounded by a high wall that enclosed a courtyard. Several smaller outbuildings dotted the perimeter, and Maria could see at least 3 potential guard positions that would need to be neutralized if the mission went kinetic. "Target acquired," she whispered into her radio. "Compound appears quiet, no visible movement." "Copy," Thompson's voice crackled back through her earpiece. "Maintain observation. Intel says our boy should show up sometime between noon and sunset." As the morning wore on, Maria settled into the familiar rhythm of surveillance. Through her scope, she watched the compound with the patience of a hunter, noting every detail that might prove relevant later. A dog wandered through the courtyard. Laundry hung from a line behind the main building. Smoke rose from what appeared to be a cooking fire. At 13:47 hours, everything changed. A convoy of 3 vehicles approached the compound from the north, moving fast and kicking up clouds of dust. Through her scope, Maria watched as armed men poured out of the trucks, their movements suggesting military training rather than the casual posture of civilian visitors. "Movement in the compound," Maria reported. 3 vehicles, approximately 12 armed personnel. "This doesn't look like a social visit." Thompson's voice came back immediately. "Can you identify the target?" Maria adjusted her scope's magnification, studying the faces of the men as they moved through the compound. The high-value target's photograph had been burned into her memory during the mission briefing, but at this distance and with the men moving constantly, positive identification was proving difficult.
"Negative on target identification," she replied.
"Too much movement, too many bodies." For the next hour, Maria watched the activity in the compound intensify. More men arrived, some carrying what appeared to be heavy equipment. Through her scope, she could see weapons being distributed and positions being prepared. Whatever was happening down there, it wasn't the quiet meeting that intelligence had predicted. At 1500 hours, everything went to hell. The first explosion came from their left flank, where Anderson had been maintaining overwatch. The detonation was followed immediately by the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifle fire, and Maria heard Anderson's voice screaming over the radio. "Contact left." "We're taking fire from multiple positions." Maria swung her Barrett toward the source of the gunfire, her scope revealing muzzle flashes among the trees approximately 300 meters from their position. Through her earpiece, she could hear Thompson shouting orders while automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. "Santos, we need fire support on those positions to our left." Thompson's voice cut through the chaos. Maria found her first target through the scope, a Taliban fighter positioned behind a fallen tree with an RPK light machine gun. The man was methodically firing bursts at Anderson's position, and Maria could see the impact of his rounds chipping bark from the trees around her teammate. She controlled her breathing, found her natural respiratory pause, and squeezed the trigger. The Barrett bucked against her shoulder, and through the scope she watched the Taliban fighter's head snap back as the .50 caliber round found its mark. One threat neutralized, but even as she acquired her next target, Maria realized they were facing more than a chance encounter with enemy patrol. This was a coordinated ambush, with Taliban fighters attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. Someone had known they were coming. "We're surrounded!" Rodriguez's voice came over the radio, punctuated by the rapid fire of his M240B machine gun. "They've got us in a kill zone." Maria swung her scope toward the compound, trying to understand how the situation had deteriorated so quickly. Through the magnified optics, she could see men running between buildings, some carrying weapons toward prepared positions, others speaking rapidly into handheld radios. Then she saw him. The high-value target emerged from the main building, his distinctive beard and facial scarring matching exactly the photographs from her briefing. But he wasn't running or hiding. Instead, he stood calmly in the compound's courtyard, directing the ambush, like a conductor leading an orchestra. "Target identified," Maria reported, her voice steady despite the chaos erupting around her. "High-value target is in the compound courtyard directing enemy operations." "Take the shot," Thompson screamed back. Maria lined up her sight picture, placing the crosshair's center mass on the target. At 800 meters, it would be a difficult shot under the best circumstances, but with incoming fire and the pressure of knowing her teammates' lives hung in the balance, it represented the kind of moment every sniper trained for but hoped never to face. She was about to squeeze the trigger when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. 3 Taliban fighters were approaching her position from the right, using a shallow ravine for concealment. In less than a minute, they'd be close enough to grenades, and Maria's position would become untenable. The choice was stark. Take the high-value target and risk being overrun, or deal with the immediate threat and lose the opportunity for the mission-critical shot. Maria made her decision in a split second.
She swung the Barrett toward the approaching fighters, acquiring the lead man just as he emerged from the ravine with an RPG. 7 rocket launcher on his shoulder.
Her shot took him center mass, the massive 50 caliber round devastating his body armor and sending his companions diving for cover. She worked the bolt action quickly, chambering a fresh round and acquiring the second fighter. This one was armed with an AK-47 and was attempting to flank her position by moving behind a cluster of boulders. Maria led his movement slightly, accounting for his speed and direction, then sent another round downrange. Bullets struck him in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him immediately. The third fighter had gone to ground behind the ravine's edge, but Maria could see the barrel of his rifle protruding from his concealed position. She adjusted her point of aim, targeting the ground near his position and relying on the Barrett's massive kinetic energy to create lethal spalling from the rocky terrain. Her shot struck the ground inches from the fighter's position, and she watched through her scope as he rolled away from his cover, clutching his face where rock fragments had found their mark.
Immediate threat neutralized, Maria reported, but even as she spoke, she could hear the firefight intensifying around their position. Webb's voice came over the radio, tension evident in his tone.
I've got multiple vehicles approaching from the north. Looks like reinforcements. Maria swung her scope back toward the compound, where she could see the high-value target still directing operations from the courtyard. But now she also counted at least 6 additional fighters moving into position around the compound's perimeter, armed with everything from assault rifles to what appeared to be a heavy machine gun. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The final sympathetics of the stages was what had started as a reconnaissance mission had become a full-scale engagement, with Rangers outnumbered and surrounded in hostile territory. Maria knew that their survival might depend on her ability to disrupt the enemy's command structure and buy time for extraction. She lined up another shot on the high-value target, but just as she was about to fire, an RPG round exploded against the rocks near Rodriguez's position. Through her earpiece, she heard him scream. Rodriguez is down. Harrison's voice cut through the chaos. I need covering fire to reach him. Maria abandoned her shot on the high-value target and began systematically engaging the enemy positions that had Rodriguez pinned down. Her first shot struck a Taliban fighter who was attempting to maneuver closer with another RPG. The second took out a sniper who'd been targeting Harrison as he tried to reach the wounded Ranger. But for every enemy fighter she eliminated, 2 more seemed to take his place. The Taliban had clearly planned this ambush carefully, pre-positioning fighters and equipment to create an inescapable kill zone. Maria realized that conventional tactics weren't going to get them out of this situation. Captain, she called over the radio. We need immediate extraction. This position is about to be overrun. Thompson's response was barely audible over the sound of gunfire. Working on it. Santos, I need you to suppress that heavy machine gun position at the compound's northeast corner. It's got the landing zone covered. Today, companies are moving to destinate position where she could see a PKM heavy machine gun emplacement that had been constructed specifically to cover the flat area they'd identified as their backup landing zone. The gun crew was systematically sweeping the area with sustained bursts, making any helicopter approach impossible. She settled into her shooting position, controlled her breathing, and sent a 50 caliber round into the machine gun position. The shot struck the weapon's receiver, destroying the gun and sending the crew scrambling for cover. But within seconds, another crew was moving to replace them, dragging a second heavy machine gun toward the same position. Multiple heavy weapons in the compound, Maria reported. They're prepared for extraction, birds. As if to emphasize her point, she heard the distinctive whine of an incoming mortar round. The explosion struck 30 meters from their position, showering the area with rocks and debris. The Taliban weren't just trying to pin them down anymore. They were systematically destroying their position with indirect fire. We've got mortars. Webb shouted over the radio. They're walking rounds toward our position. Maria realized they had perhaps 5 minutes before the mortar fire became accurate enough to force them from their positions.
Once they lost the high ground, their chances of survival dropped to nearly zero.
They needed a miracle, or they needed to create their own. She keyed her radio, speaking directly to Thompson. "Sir, I've got an idea, but it's going to require everyone to trust me completely." "Talk fast, Santos." "The compound's main building has a fuel storage area on its south side. I can see diesel barrels and what looks like a generator fuel tank. If I can get a tracer round into that storage area, it'll create enough chaos to cover our movement to the alternate landing zone."
There was a pause, filled only by the sound of gunfire and another incoming mortar round that exploded closer to their position. "That's a hell of a shot," Thompson replied. 800 meters moving targets, and you need to hit a specific target to create secondary explosions. "Roger that, sir. It's what I'm here for." Maria lined up the shot, studying the compound through her scope. The fuel storage area was partially concealed behind the main building, with only a narrow window of opportunity where she could see the diesel barrels clearly. She'd have one chance, maybe two, at most, before the enemy realized what she was attempting and adjusted their positions to block her line of sight. She loaded a tracer round into the Barrett's chamber, the phosphorus-tipped ammunition specifically designed to ignite flammable materials on impact. Through her scope, she could see enemy fighters moving between the buildings, the high-value targets still directing operations from the courtyard, and most importantly, the cluster of fuel barrels that represented their best hope for survival. Maria controlled her breathing, found her natural respiratory pause, and prepared to take the most important shot of her career. 800 meters away, Taliban fighters continued their assault, unaware that their entire operation was about to change in the space of a heartbeat. The tracer round left the Barrett's barrel at 2,800 feet per second, its phosphorus tip glowing like a miniature comet as it arced across the valley. Maria watched through her scope as the bullet tracked toward its target, every millisecond stretching into eternity as she waited to see if her desperate gambit would succeed. The round struck the largest diesel barrel dead center, penetrating the metal container and igniting its contents in a brilliant flash.
The initial explosion was followed immediately by a chain reaction as the fire spread to adjacent fuel containers, creating a massive fireball that rose above the compound's walls like an angry orange mushroom. The secondary explosions followed almost immediately. The generator's fuel tank detonated with enough force to shatter windows in the main building, while burning diesel created a thick black smoke screen that obscured most of the compound from view. But most importantly, the explosion had achieved its intended effect: chaos. Through her earpiece, Maria could hear enemy radio chatter becoming increasingly frantic as Taliban fighters struggled to understand what had happened and respond to the new threat.
Several of them abandoned their positions to fight the spreading fire, while others ran toward the compound to check on their leadership.
"Now," Thompson's voice cut through the confusion. "All elements move to the alternate LZ. Santos, provide overwatch."
Maria watched through her scope as her teammates began their fighting withdrawal from the ridgeline. Rodriguez, despite his wounds, was moving under his own power, with Harrison providing support.
Webb and Anderson laid down covering fire while Thompson coordinated their movement through the rocky terrain, but the Taliban response was faster than Maria had anticipated.
Even as the compound burned behind them, enemy fighters were repositioning to cut off the Rangers' route to the landing zone. She could see at least 8 fighters moving through the forest, using the smoke as concealment while they attempted to establish an ambush along the withdrawal route. Maria began engaging targets methodically, her Barrett speaking with its distinctive thunder as she cleared the path for her teammates. Her first shot took down a fighter who was setting up a PKM machine gun behind a fallen tree. The second eliminated a sniper who had climbed into a tree overlooking the withdrawal route. "Multiple targets moving to intercept," she reported over the radio. "I'm engaging, but you need to move fast." The firefight that followed would later be described in after-action reports as one of the most intense small-unit engagements of the entire Afghanistan campaign. Maria found herself fighting not just to cover her teammates' withdrawal, but to survive against an enemy that had identified her position and was systematically trying to eliminate her with concentrated fire. An RPG round exploded against the rocks near her position, showering her with debris and temporarily stunning her with its concussion. When her vision cleared, she could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different positions, all focused on her location. The Taliban had realized that eliminating her would remove the most significant threat to their ambush. Maria grabbed her M4 carbine and rolled away from her original position just as another RPG round struck the exact spot where she'd been lying seconds before.
The Barrett was too heavy and unwieldy for the kind of close-quarters fighting she now faced, but she couldn't abandon it completely.
The weapon represented too much firepower to leave for the enemy. She found new cover behind a different cluster of rocks and keyed her radio.
I'm taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Barrett is temporarily out of action, switching to M4.
Copy that, Thompson replied. We're 2 minutes from the LZ. Hold them off until we can get birds inbound. 2 minutes might as well have been 2 hours.
Maria could hear enemy fighters moving through the rocks around her position, speaking in rapid Pashto as they attempted to coordinate their assault. She had perhaps 30 rounds left for her M4, plus her sidearm and the grenades on her combat vest.
Against an unknown number of enemy fighters with superior local knowledge and position to cut off her escape route, the odds were not encouraging. The first Taliban fighter appeared on her left flank, moving cautiously between the boulders with his AK-47 at the ready.
Maria waited until he was completely exposed before engaging her M4, speaking in controlled bursts that dropped him before he could return fire. But his death cry alerted the others to her new position, and within seconds she was receiving fire from multiple directions. Maria threw a fragmentation grenade toward the largest concentration of muzzle flashes, then used the explosion's distraction to move again. She was playing a deadly game of cat and mouse among the rocks, using her superior training and equipment to offset the enemy's numerical advantage. But she knew it was only a matter of time before they managed to surround her completely. That's when she heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distinctive whop 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 of approaching helicopter rotors.
Birds inbound. Thompson's voice crackled over the radio. Santos, we need that LZ cleared now. Maria looked toward the designated landing zone and saw the problem immediately.
3 Taliban fighters had positioned themselves with RPGs at the edge of the flat area, preparing to engage the incoming helicopters. At this range, her M4 carbine lacked both the accuracy and the stopping power to guarantee their elimination before they could fire.
She needed the Barrett. Abandoning cover, Maria sprinted back toward her original position, ignoring the bullets that cracked past her head as enemy fighters tried to track her movement.
The .50 caliber rifle lay exactly where she'd left it, its scope slightly damaged by debris but otherwise intact.
She dove into position behind the weapon just as the first Chinook helicopter appeared over the valley rim, flying fast and low as it approached the landing zone. The Taliban fighters with the RPGs were already taking aim, their weapons trained on the aircraft's flight path.
Maria didn't have time for her usual careful aiming procedure. She estimated the range at 400 meters, accounted for the slight downward angle, and fired at the first RPG team. The Barrett's massive recoil drove her shoulder into the rocky ground, but through her scope she saw her target go down hard. She worked the bolt action frantically, chambering another round, as the second RPG team prepared to fire. The Chinook was less than 10 seconds from touchdown, its door gunners laying down suppressing fire, but unable to see the concealed threats that were targeting them. Maria's second shot struck the second RPG gunner's center mass, but the third fighter was already shouldering his weapon and taking aim at the helicopter. At this range, with the aircraft's large profile and predictable flight path, it would be nearly impossible to miss. Without conscious thought, Maria transitioned to her M4 carbine and fired every remaining round in her magazine in a sustained burst, walking the bullets across the Taliban fighter's position. She couldn't see through the smoke and dust whether she'd hit him, but she saw his RPG round fly wide of its target, exploding harmlessly in the forest beyond the landing zone. The Chinook touched down, with its rotors still spinning, and Maria could see her teammates running across the open ground toward the aircraft.
But the firefight wasn't over. More Taliban fighters were emerging from the forest, trying to reach positions where they could engage the helicopter before it could take off.
Maria reloaded her M4 and began engaging these new targets, providing covering fire for her teammates' final sprint to safety. She could see Thompson and Webb helping Rodriguez toward the aircraft while Harrison and Anderson maintained a rearguard action against pursuing fighters. Santos, Thompson's voice came over the radio. Move to extract, now. But Maria could see what Thompson couldn't from his position.
More Taliban fighters were approaching the landing zone from the north, and if she abandoned her position now, they'd be able to engage the Chinook during its most vulnerable moment. Takeoff. Negative, she replied.
I've got multiple targets moving to engage during departure. I'll hold them off until you're airborne, then move to alternate extraction. There was a pause, then Thompson's voice came back with an edge of desperation. Santos, there is no alternate extraction. This is the only bird we've got. Maria understood the implications immediately. If she missed this helicopter,
She'd be stranded alone in hostile territory with limited ammunition and an unknown number of enemy fighters hunting for her. The smart play was to abandon her position immediately and sprint for the aircraft. But the professional soldier in her, the sniper who'd trained for years to make the hard decisions under pressure, knew that leaving now would likely result in the helicopter being shot down during takeoff.
Her teammates' lives hung in the balance, and there was really only one choice she could make. Tell Rodriguez he owes me a beer. She replied, then switched her radio to the helicopter's frequency.
Chalk 1, this is Overwatch. You've got multiple RPGs moving to engage positions during your departure.
I'll suppress them until you're clear, then find my own way home. The Chinook pilot's voice came back immediately.
Overwatch, we're not leaving you behind. We can hold position until you reach the bird.
Negative. Chalk 1. Every second you stay on the ground increases the risk to the package. Execute departure immediately on my mark. Maria could see the last of her teammates boarding the helicopter while Taliban fighters continued to move through the forest toward firing positions. She had perhaps 60 seconds to disrupt their attack before the Chinook would be vulnerable during its takeoff climb. She returned to the Barrett, ignoring the increasingly accurate enemy fire that was now focused entirely on her position. Through her scope, she could see a Taliban fighter with an RPG approaching from the northeast using a shallow depression for concealment. Her shot took him down at 300 meters. Another fighter appeared on the opposite flank, also armed with an RPG and moving toward a position with a clear line of sight to the landing zone. Maria swung the Barrett toward him, but as she lined up her shot, she heard the distinctive crack of a sniper's rifle, and pain exploded through her left shoulder. The bullet had come from somewhere in the forest to her east, fired by a marksman who'd finally managed to get a clear shot at her position. Maria felt the Barrett's grip slick with her own blood, but the wound wasn't immediately disabling. She could still shoot. She found the second RPG team through her scope and fired, watching the target drop just as the Chinook's engines began to spool up for takeoff. Behind her, she could hear enemy fighters getting closer, their voices echoing among the rocks as they coordinated their final assault on her position. Chalk 1, you are clear to depart, Maria transmitted. Execute immediately. The helicopter lifted off in a cloud of dust and debris, its door gunners providing suppressing fire as it climbed away from the landing zone. Maria watched it disappear over the valley rim, carrying her teammates to safety, and felt a strange sense of satisfaction despite her increasingly desperate situation. She'd done her job. The Rangers were safe, the mission was complete, and the high-value target was almost certainly dead in the compound fire. The fact that she might not survive to see the after-action report was simply the price of being a soldier in a place where good people sometimes died doing their duty. But Maria Santos had never been the type to give up easily. She abandoned the Barrett, which was too heavy for what came next, and began moving through the rocks with her M4 carbine at the ready. She had one fragmentation grenade left, approximately 40 rounds of ammunition, and enough medical supplies to treat her shoulder wound if she could find a few minutes of safety. More importantly, she had the same training and determination that had gotten her this far, plus something the Taliban fighters hunting her lacked. She had nothing left to lose. The firefight that followed would become legend in special operations circles, though Maria herself would never discuss the details publicly. What is known is that it took the Taliban fighters nearly 4 hours to finally corner her in a narrow canyon, 2 kilometers from the original battle site. When the rescue helicopter finally arrived at first light the following morning, guided by Maria's emergency beacon, they found her unconscious from blood loss, but alive, surrounded by the bodies of 11 enemy fighters. The Barrett MA-2A1 she'd carried into battle lay beside her, its barrel still warm from the night's fighting. 3 weeks later, as Maria recovered in a military hospital in Germany, Captain Thompson visited her room carrying a small wooden box. Inside was the bronze star with V, Device for Valor, along with a handwritten note from Rodriguez that simply read, I owe you a beer. Hell, I owe you a case. But more than the medal or the recognition, what mattered to Maria was the knowledge that she'd proven herself in the crucible of combat. The Rangers who'd once questioned whether a woman belonged in their ranks now spoke of her with the same reverence they reserved for their greatest heroes. She'd opened the landing zone when they said it couldn't be done, had held her position when retreat would have been understandable, and had fought through the night to survive when survival seemed impossible. The system had said she didn't belong there. Her teammates had said it couldn't be done. Rangers said it couldn't be done, until she stepped in with a Barrett and opened the LZ.